America. This characterization of Charles Dickens takes place at a press dinner at the famous New York restaurant Delmonico's in 1868, as Mr. Dickens completes his second tour of the United States. As an educator and actor, and now a local resident of Pacific Grove since 2013, we extend our welcome to Howard tonight, or should I say Charles. Nancy and I will return at the end of Howard's performance to take your questions and then highlight some announcements for the remainder of this crazy 2020. Howard, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Hello, everybody. I'm Howard Burnham, and I'm a writer and performer of literary and historical characterizations. Now, obviously, I'm not Mr. Dickens at the moment. I need to turn myself into Mr. Dickens before your amazed sight. So I will, he wasn't as follically challenged as I am. So first of all, goes my Mr. Dickens wig, like so. And my Dickensian whiskers. And my Dickensian moustaches. And rather than just look at my talking head, I now go to share screen and hopefully bring up my Charles Dickens slides. There we go. And as Fred said, Mr. Dickens came to America twice. Came first 1842 to 3, and the second time 1867 to 68, at the end of which he was given a farewell dinner at Delmonico's with Horace Greeley in the chair. And this is my surmise as to what the inimitable Boz said on that memorable occasion. Mr. Greeley, gentlemen, I am in the business of telling tales. I would like to open these proceedings with the first story that I can remember being told when I was a child. It was told to me by my nurse, and you may well think that it is a very unsuitable story to tell a small child, for it is the tale of Captain Murderer. Captain Murderer was not only very, very charming, he was the richest man in town. He lived in a magnificent mansion on top of a hill and had in his stables 12 milk-white horses. For staff, he had a wicked cook and an evil blacksmith, and Tibbles his one-eyed cat. Now, Captain Murderer devoted his great wealth to his twin passions, which were matrimony and cannibalism. When Captain Murderer came a-courting, carriage and 6, but when he came a-marrying, he came in a carriage and 12. And he always planted a curious herb on the pathway leading to the church. As he led his bride up the pathway, the bride would exclaim, "Ooh, Captain Murderer, what is that strange herb?" "That, my dear, is garnish for my house lamb." And the captain laughed, revealing a set of razor-sharp incisor teeth. The bride was somewhat startled, as were the wedding guests, but then Captain Murderer was not only very, very charming, he was the richest man in town, and rich people are allowed their little eccentricities. Now, on the day after the marriage, the captain came to his bride with a silver bowl and a golden rolling pin and said, "My dear, it is time for you to make me a pie. Here is flour and eggs and all things necessary." So the bride turned up her sleeves, kneaded the dough, rolled it out, lined the pie dish, leaving sufficient to cover, whilst the captain meanwhile went off to sharpen his sword with the assistance of Tibbles, his one-eyed cat. When he returned, the bride would say, "Captain Murderer, what sort of pie is it to be?" A meat pie, my dear. But Captain Murderer, I see no meat. Look in the mirror, my dear. And the bride looked in the mirror just in time to see the captain slice off her head. The captain filleted the bride, put the dainty pieces into the pie, and gave it to his evil cook to bake. He then went to his wicked blacksmith, who sharpened his teeth to an even more razor sharpness. By the time that was done, the pie was baked, and the captain sat down to dine. Now the captain went on this way for several years, and people were a little surprised at the frequency with which he got married. But then Captain Murderer was not only very, very charming, he was the wealthiest man in town, and wealthy people must have their little eccentricities. But then the captain came a-courting to two sisters. One was fair and one was dark. The fair-haired sister was besotted with the captain, but the dark-haired sister, a wiser girl, mistrusted him. So he proposed to the fair-haired girl and went through his usual routines. But what he did not know was the dark-haired sister had crept up to the house on the hill the following day and peeped through the window and seen the captain murder her sister and consume her. The dark-haired girl was determined to be revenged, but how? Nobody would believe her because Captain Murderer was not only very, very charming, he was the wealthiest man in town. But then an idea struck her. She went up to the house on the hill and knocked on the door and said, "Captain Murderer, I only pretended that I didn't like you because I was jealous of my sister, who seems to have disappeared. I think it'd be lovely if you would marry me." The captain was delighted and again went through his usual routines. But what he did not know was that just before he sliced off her head, the dark-haired girl had swallowed a box of poison strong. He gave the pie to the wicked cook to bake, and then went to his blacksmith to have his teeth sharpened, and then went to dine. But no sooner had he finished eating this pie than Captain Murderer began to swell. Larger and larger he grew. His face turned bright blue with white spots, and steam hissed out of his ears and mouth and nose and navel. But he continued to grow and grow until eventually, bang, he exploded with such a loud report that it panicked the 12 milk-white horses which stampeded through the house, trampling to death the evil cook and the wicked blacksmith, and Tibbles the one-eyed cat. And that was the end of Captain Murderer. And as my nurse concluded, "And so you see, Master Charles, all young ladies want to be very particular as to the gentleman of their choice. Now, my dear, night-night, sleep tight, pleasant dreams." Now, Mr. Greeley, you asked me to talk about my life and my visits to your extraordinary country. I was born in Portsmouth on the south coast in the year 1812, which must be a very easy date for you Americans to remember, as that was the year in which the young American Republic had the temerity to declare war on Great Britain. The War of 1812, in which my father played a small part. My father, John Dickens, was a clerk, or clerk as you pronounce it, in the Navy office, equipping the king's ships, although I hope he did not equip the unfortunate HMS Guerriere for its encounter with the USS Constitution. My father, John, was a delightful man, witty, humorous, charming, but utterly feckless with no concept of financial probity. When we moved to London, he swiftly found himself in debt to the tune of £40 to his baker, for which he was arrested and taken to a sponging house to be squeezed in the hope that the money might be produced. He ordered me, as a 11-year-old boy, to run round his friends in town, begging them for money to assist my father. The money was not forthcoming, so father was conveyed to the Marshalsea debtors' prison. We were socially ruined. My mother removed me from school and sent me to work at her cousin's blacking factory on the River Thames, where I sat 12 hours a day labeling blacking bottles. Terrible humiliation, sitting beside common working boys, one of whom, incidentally, happened to be called Fagin. At that time, my mother moved me out of our lodgings to get out of her way and placed me with a certain Mrs. Roylance, who had a reputation as being a queller of children. I later used her as the model for Mrs. Pipchin in my novel Dombey and Son.
Well, sir, and how do you think you'll like me? I don't think I like you at all. And this isn't my house. No, sir, it's my house. It's a very nasty one. We have a nastier place, the cupboard under the stairs, where we put our naughty boys.
And little Paul sat, like one who had taken lodgings unfurnished, and the upholsterer was never, ever coming. Fortunately, a relative of my father's passed away and left him a legacy with which he was able to discharge his debt and obtain release from the Marshalsea. But my mother, at the time, insisted that I should stay working at the blacking factory to augment the family income. I can never forget, I will never forget, that my own mother was hot for keeping me there. Fortunately, father insisted that I should be removed and sent back to school, where, amongst other things, having escaped the blacking factory, I perfected the newfangled shorthand method of writing, so that when I graduated from school, I obtained employment as a reporter on parliamentary debates in the House of Commons and on legal cases in the Court of Doctors' Commons, both of which have given me a lifelong contempt for politicians and lawyers. Now, one chill, rain-washed evening in November of 1833, I posted into the editor's box of the monthly magazine the manuscript of a short story that I had written. The following month, December, having paid £0.50, I had the enormous excitement of seeing for the first time a piece of my creative writing in print, A Dinner at Poplar Walk. Mr. Augustus Minns was a bachelor of about 40, as he said, of about 48, as his friend said. He was always exceedingly neat, tidy, and precise. He wore a frock coat without a wrinkle and boots without a fault. He held a position of some value under the government at Somerset House, and was possessed of a private fortune of £10,000. And when he went abroad, he always carried a brown silk umbrella with an ivory handle. He lived in bachelor lodgings in Tavistock Street, Covent Garden. Now, there were two species of created being that Mr. Augustus Minns held in the utmost detestation and horror. And these were children and dogs. He was not an unamiable man, but he could have viewed the assassination of an infant or the execution of a dog with the liveliest satisfaction. You see, their habits were so much at variance with his own. Mr. Augustus Minns had only one living relative, a cousin whom he detested, but to whose son he had consented to become godfather by proxy at a distance. This cousin, Mr. Octavius Budden, having achieved a substantial fortune following the trade of corn chandler, had retired with Amelia, the wife of his bosom, to a handsome villa in Poplar Walk, Stamford Hill, about 5 miles from central London. One evening, Mr. and Mrs. Budden were admiring their son, Master Alexander Augustus Budden, discussing his various merits, when Mrs. Budden said to her lord,
"Dearest, your cousin Minns is a man of some substance, and he is a bachelor. Don't you think you should go and interest him on behalf of our dear little Alexander?" "Oh, Alec, take your feet off the chair, naughty, naughty. Oh, bless him. Your cousin, you know, he's got no children of his own, and he might leave him all his money."
Yeah, that's a good idea, wife. I tell you what, I'll go up to town tomorrow and invite him to come down here and dine with us on Sunday. He might leave Alec all his money. Good idea. The following morning at Tavistock Square, Mr. Minns was alternately biting a piece of dry toast and casting his eye down the columns of his newspaper, when a knock on the door was followed by his manservant John, entering with a small card engraved with large letters, "Mr. Octavius Budden, Amelia Cottage, Poplar Walk, Stamford Hill." Oh no! What on earth can bring that vulgar little man here? John, tell him I'm out. Tell him I'm out and will never be back. Anything to keep him downstairs. Begging your pardon, sir, but the gentleman's already coming up. Which was made apparent by an appalling squeaking of boots on the stairs, accompanied by a pattering noise, the cause of which Minns could not discern for the moment. The following moment, however, the door burst open and Budden strode in, preceded by a large white dog with pink eyes and a ridiculous tail. Minns staggered under the dog's appearance, as the dog proceeded to take a piece of bread and butter from the table and consume it, butter side next the carpet. "Oh, look at my dog. Always makes himself at home like me. I'll have a slice of that ham there, and get your man to bring up some more muffins and another pot of coffee. I like to make myself at home." "Oh, now look what my dog's doing. He's attacking your curtains, Minns." And indeed, the dog was tearing at the red velvet curtains. With a great deal of poking with the ivory-handled umbrella, the dog was eventually dislodged and dragged onto the landing and shut out, whereupon it started an appalling howling and scratching of the door panels. "Hey, grand dog for the country, that, but he's not much used to confinement. Now, how are you, Minns? You do look capital. Yes, I'm extremely well, thank you, Button. And how is Mrs. Button and little Alec, my son, you mean? Oh, he couldn't be better at a place like we've got at Stamford Hill. You must come down and dine with us on Sunday. I will not take no for an answer. At length, Minns, driven to distraction, accepted the invitation, and his unwelcome guests were ushered out. Sunday came round, and everybody went happily about their business except for Mr. Minns. The down coach from London deposited him outside Amelia Cottage on Stamford Walk, and his knock at the door was answered by a stumpy, sniffling boy in drab blue livery, who said, "Oh, yeah, you must be the cousin this way." Minns was shown up to the drawing room, where, to his horror, he realized he was the last arrival and the social lion of a group of people assembled for that most tedious of times, the hour preceding dinner. At length, the arrival of Mrs. Budden caused a general rise, and they went down to dine. Dinner passed off as such dinners usually do. With the dessert and wine being placed upon the table, at a significant look from Mrs. Budden, the servant brought down Master Alexander Augustus Budden to be inspected by his godfather. Yes, you are a fine little fellow, aren't you?
Yes.
How old are you?
8. How old are you? Alexander, you shouldn't ask your godfather how old he is. He asked me how old I was. Give us an apple, Ma.
Oh, gentlemen, charge your glasses, and ladies too, for I have a toast to propose. There is a gentleman here in whose company we have all taken the greatest delight, and that gentleman is, in point of fact, my cousin Minns, who, curiously, is a relation of mine. So, with the honours, everybody, hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah! Hip hip, huzzah! Minns gulped down a glass of port wine in the horrific realization that he now had to propose a response to the toast. Providentially, the stumpy boy in blue livery re-entered at that moment to announce that there's a storm coming on, and the up coach has said he's got room for one more if the gentleman would care to run round sharpish to the Old Swan Tavern. Unfortunately, it was a couple of minutes before Mr. Minns realised that he had left his brown silk umbrella in the down coach coming down, so that by the time he ran round to the Old Swan Tavern, a feat for which he was not equipped, the up coach, the last up coach, had departed. He had not gone 100 yards before the storm broke. Wet, miserable, dejected. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he knocked for admittance at Tavistock Square. He summoned his attorney the next morning to make his will. And his man of law informs me, in that strict confidence with which I inform my public, that neither the name of Mr. Octavius Budden, nor of Mrs. Amelia Budden, nor of Master Alexander Augustus Budden appears therein. So, that was my first piece of creative writing ever in print. I later revised it, gave it a new title of Mr. Minns and His Cousin, and inserted it into my first book, The Sketches by Boz. Now, a young man's thoughts turn to love. As a young reporter, I became obsessed with the beautiful Miss Maria Beadnell, I wrote many passionate love letters to her, but unfortunately her parents discovered that my father had been in debtor's prison. And so she returned my letters to me, declaring that I was a mere boy and not worthy of her intention. Boy, B-O-Y. Many years later, when I was the most successful novelist in England, I had a letter from Maria, who was now the widow of a failed timber merchant called Mr. Winter. And I went to see her, imagining that she still might be the beautiful, flirtatious, delightful creature that I'd fallen in love with. Instead, I found her fat and loquacious. And I used her as the model for Flora Finching in Little Dorrit, meeting again Arthur Clennam, her former lover after many, many years. Oh, Mr. Clennam, Mr. Clennam, Mr. Clennam, you found me. I'm a frightful old fright now, aren't I? You know, when I go out with Papa, people think that I am Papa's Mama. You've been in India, I understand. Is it true that the Indian ladies wear pagodas on their heads? No, they don't. Well, I suppose you must have married a Chinese lady, is a Chinese or Indian, a Chinese lady. No, you didn't marry a Chinese lady. I don't suppose you kept yourself single on my account. No. Revenge is sweetest taken cold. I turn my attentions to the doe-eyed Georgina Hogarth, who I'm happy to say did accept my offer of marriage. Her younger sister, Mary, came to live with us in the early months of our marriage. And I loved to walk abroad through the streets of London with the sisters, one on each arm, my pair of petticoats, I called them. But then one evening, returning from the theatre, as we were going up the stairs, beautiful 17-year-old Mary suddenly fell back into my arms and died. Beautiful, young and good, God, in his mercy, made her one of his angels. All my heroines have been based on Mary Hogarth. My first great success was the Pickwick Papers, followed by Oliver Twist, and then I became editor of Master Humphrey's Clock, in which I published Barnaby Rudge and the Old Curiosity Shop, the latter of which caused such a furore in your United States of America. People would rush down to the docks in New York City and cry out to the incoming ship from England, "Is Little Nell still alive?" I was very flattered and very pleased. And moreover, I became obsessed with a desire to visit your young country and to see the exciting experiment of democracy at work. So, in the winter of 1842, I boarded the steamship Britannia, bound for America, with my wife and her maid Anne. The crossing was extremely disagreeable. The storms of winter tossed us here and there. And I remember on one occasion, my wife and Anne were in a state of such panic that I thought the only answer would be hot brandy and water. Unfortunately, they were sitting on a long sofa that went across the whole length of the saloon. And when I got to them with the hot brandy and water, the ship gave a lurch and they slid to the far end of the bench. And by the time I'd got down there, the ship gave a lurch the other direction. By the time I got back there, they had gone back the other way. and we dodged one another for about 10 minutes, by which time most of the hot brandy and water had disappeared. Reaching at last Boston, I ran out that first evening into the snow, observing the statue of Mr. Paul Revere. I had my portrait painted in Boston. Though I did not get on terribly well with high Boston society, who regarded me as a bit of a Cockney upstart. I created a certain scandal at a fashionable dinner party with the Boston Brahmins, where they were discussing the reigning English beauties, the Duchess of Manchester and the Honourable Mrs. Norton, and they asked me for my opinion. Well, I said, well, in my opinion, the Duchess was the handsomer woman, but Mrs. Norton was by far the more kissable. You could have heard a pin drop. I toured extensively in America, going up into Canada, and as far west as Cairo and St. Louis. I went to Washington, where I was presented to President Polk. We admired one another, and I think each was satisfied with what he saw. In Philadelphia, I was introduced to the writer Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, who appeared to be in a particularly gloomy mood. So I showed him the portrait of the artist Daniel Maclise had done of my children and of our pet raven, Jip, a character from Barnaby Rudge. So I like to think that I am, in point of fact, the godfather of a certain poem by Mr. Poe. Now, I had intended to go south as far as Charleston, South Carolina, but I only got as far as Richmond, Virginia. For it was there that I beheld the South's peculiar institution of chattel slavery. I was appalled. Was this the great free democracy that I had come to see? Was this the state where all men are created equal? I was appalled by the humbug and hypocrisy of it all. Moreover, I further alienated my American hosts by criticizing the infringement of British copyright. My and my fellow English novelists' books were printed in America without one penny piece coming to us. And I was castigated in American newspapers as being an aggressive, jumped up little Cockney money grubber. So, with a rather jaundiced view of the young United States, I returned to England and proceeded to write my highly critical American notes and the equally critical American chapters in my next novel, Martin Chuzzlewit. For example, Martin's first encounter with Colonel Diver and the New York Rowdy Journal. Colonel Diver adjusted his cane and, looking quizzically at Martin, extended his hand. Colonel Diver, sir, editor of the New York Rowdy Journal. This young boy here is distributing that organ that is the voice of American democracy, freedom, and its concomitant accompaniment, namely intelligence and dollars. Come with me, sir, and I will show you our premises. The colonel conducted Martin to a dingy dwelling on which was emblazoned with the words, Rowdy Journal. As they entered, they came in sight of a young man seated on a table with a large pair of scissors. He had that nose on which the appellation snub is given, and his upper lip had a kind of sandy down, which was an heroic but unsuccessful attempt to grow a moustache. Martin assumed that this must be the colonel's little son, playing at editor in all the guileless innocence of youth, when the colonel stopped Martin short by announcing, "My war correspondent, sir, Mr. Jefferson Brick. You have heard of Jefferson Brick, sir?" You mean to say you've not heard of him? Tell me, sir, what of Jefferson Brick's articles has caused the most distress to the British Parliament or the Court of St. James's? Oh, you Europeans, you're so ignorant. I think we must have a glass of champagne to settle our nerves. Jefferson, you propose the toast.
Thank you, Colonel. I will. I propose the health of the Rowdy Journal and the well of truth that it is, which, albeit composed of printer's ink, I can see clearly the destiny of my great country. I give you America and the Rowdy Journal.
The colonel and his war correspondent fell to drinking, whilst Martin, bemused, fell to perusing the columns of the Rowdy Journal. Well, after that, it's not surprising that for almost 2 decades, I was persona non grata in the United States. Back in England in 1843, I need quickly to raise some money. I therefore took a little episode from the Pickwick Papers, the tale of the sextons who stole, the goblins who stole a sexton, namely Gabriel Grubb, enlarged it, changed its setting, and published it Christmas 1843 as A Christmas Carol, which I believe has proven to be the most successful of my Christmas books. I continue to write my novels, but then I discovered that I could have a second and far more profitable career by giving dramatic readings of excerpts from my books. By the 1860s, I was perhaps not the greatest novelist in Europe, but certainly the most popular novelist. So it was that following your terrible civil war, that you made me an offer I could not refuse. An offer to make a second tour of the United States, this time reading extracts from my books. On my second visit to the greatly enlarged Washington, D.C., I was received by President Johnson and Secretary Seward. Mr. Seward told me very interesting details of Abraham Lincoln's last cabinet meeting. I also met Mr. Emerson and Mr. Longfellow, as well as other distinguished Americans. My reading tour was a triumphant success. So, as I draw towards a conclusion, let me give you 2 tiny little reading fragments. First, Mrs. Gamp meeting Mr. Mould, the undertaker, from Martin Chuzzlewit.
I'm coming. Oh, it's you, Mr. Mould. Oh, so the gentleman's dead then. Oh, well, it's what we must all come to. It's the same as being born, only we can't make our calculations quite so exact. Oh, well, I'll lay him out beautiful. You know, I love the human race so much that I'd like to lay them all out for free. Oh, thank you, Mr. Mould. You know me of old. That's very gracious of you. Now, just Just send the girl up to me, and I've got full instructions for her. Thank you, Mr. Mould. Right, now then, Mr. Dedden, you don't want that pillow, won't do you any good, but I'm going to have it. I'm going to make myself as comfortable as I can whilst I watches over you. It's better, yeah. Oh, yeah, young woman. I like a nice bit of cheese and some fresh butter and some bread and a shilling's worth of gin. And just put it on a mantelpiece there, and I'll just put my lips to it when I feel so disposed. Yeah. Rich folks may go on camels, but it's not so easy for them to see through the eye of a needle. That's my comfort, and I'm keeping to it. Mrs. Gamp. And secondly, as an antidote to Colonel Diver and Jefferson Brick, may I present Mr. Podsnap from our mutual friend, in order to prove that Englishmen can be equally chauvinistic. Mr. Podsnap was giving a dinner party, and after much consideration and hesitation, he had invited a foreign gentleman to the table, for he feared that all foreigners were in a conspiracy to bring a blush to the cheek of the young possum, by which he indicated his rocking horse of a daughter, Georgiana. He presented the foreign gentleman to Madame Podsnap, and was going to say, Mademoiselle Podsnap, ma filly, but thought better of it. Instead, he asked, tell me, sir, have you seen on the streets of London here, London, Londres, London, traces of our glorious British Constitution? The foreign gentleman begged to be excused, but he did not quite understand. The British Constitution, sir, is composed of such sterling qualities, namely delicacy, modesty, and the absence of anything likely to bring a blush to the cheek of the young possum. And with his favorite gesture, he concluded, you would look in vain anywhere else in the world to find such sterling qualities. And with his favorite gesture, he consigned the rest of Europe, Africa, and Asia, the Americas, to absolute oblivion. Mr. Greeley, gentlemen, I must end by saying that on my second tour of your extraordinary, wonderful country, I have been met with such delicacy, such consideration, such politeness, that I intend to put a preface into those two books of mine, The American Notes and Martin Chuzzlewit, in which formerly I have dealt rather harshly with your country. A notice to the effect that it is now the most amazing country I have ever encountered. Gentlemen, there is no flag flying, with the exception of our own, that stirs an Englishman's heart more than your stars and stripes. I was born at a time of conflict between our two great nations, but let me say, it would be better for this planet to be struck by a meteorite than our two great nations that at different times and in their different ways have striven for democracy
and freedom, ever to go to war with one another again. I thank you all very much. Your servant, Charles Dickens.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Howard. This is great insights into a famous author that we've all known to grow and love in our childhood or otherwise, and the performances that have made the stage as well. So this is absolutely wonderful. A great evening's entertainment here. With regard to some questions, if folks have questions, please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A or the chat window. We're watching for that. But I'll start the process here with a couple of things that came to mind. Howard, you're obviously of British origin.
Yes.
What brought you over to the United States, and give us a little bit more of your background?
Right. Well, my grandfather was a Californian mining engineer who ended up in South Africa following his very famous elder brother, Howard Burnham, the scout and explorer. And he married a British girl in South Africa and ended up in England. So half my family sound like you and half my family sound like me, because I'm a quarter American, I suppose, from my grandfather. And my midlife crisis was to come to my grandfather's country and follow a second career, because most of my early career was in education. I was a deputy head or vice principal of a private school in England for a quarter of a century. But I've always loved theatre, and I've worked in theatre quite a lot. And I thought, well, I'll come to America and see if I can be a gypsy, become an actor. So I came to originally to South Carolina, of all unlikely places, but I did a rather good job in South Carolina because I cornered the market in redcoat generals who came to grief during the American Revolution. I did a very good Lord Cornwallis, and then I went up to New York State and did Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne at Saratoga, and that kept me in beer and skittles. And then my wife, whose parents actually lived for a time and worked in Pacific Grove, said, right, it's time for us to retire now. We've got sufficient money. We can sell the house in South Carolina. And originally we could sell the house in South Carolina and buy a garage in California. But fortunately, some elderly relative fell off his perch who had no children. And so unlike Master Augustus Budden, I did inherit from my uncle. And so we could move to Pacific Grove. And I've been here for the past 7 years, doing a lot of work with Pac Rep. Although I hasten to add that the work that I do with Pac Rep is legitimate theatre, because I have no music theatre skills at all. I cannot sing and I cannot dance, but I can sort of act.
Indeed. That's great. So what have you done with Pac Rep?
Well, I started off by playing Camillo in Winter's Tale, and I think I played the banker in Moll Flanders, and then I played various roles in Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And my best year was in 2016 when I played Malvolio at the Forest Theatre in Twelfth Night, and I played Gloucester in King Lear. And that's, if you can't play King Lear, the second best part for an old man is to play Gloucester. So it was great.
Great, absolutely outstanding. So let me put you back on the hot seat here with regard to who you were acting on behalf of, and see if we can extract some more insights there, if it works for you. Dickens obviously was a prolific writer and performer in his readings, as you portrayed here. When did he do, so he started off writing for a weekly journal, as I understand from information, but the novels that we probably are most noteworthy for us are things like Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. When did those happen as books in the timeline that you also portrayed here with his visits to
Well,
America?
yes.
Were they mostly before or after or during? Have any
Well,
sense of that?
quite a spread with those titles, actually, because obviously
Yeah.
Oliver Twist is a very early novel. Oliver Twist is really the first sort of thing that we would accept as being a novel, as opposed to the Pickwick Papers, which is a series of lots of comic sketches with lots of little stories in them. But Oliver Twist is really the first sort of continuous novel that he wrote. And that was, of course, followed by the Barnaby Rudge, one of his 2 historical novels, not as popular as The Tale of Two Cities, which is the other historical novel. Well, it has some good things in it. And then, of course, The Old Curiosity Shop, which everybody in America was obsessed with because of the character of Little Nell, and that wonderful remark of Oscar Wilde that one should have to have a heart of stone not to laugh at the death of Little Nell. Because everybody else was so it's a wicked thing to say, but and lots of people said that Little Nell should have been killed at the start of the novel rather than at the end of the novel. But David Copperfield was Dickens' favourite novel. That's his most autobiographical novel, because there's lots of elements of his own life that appear in that. The hard schooling that he had at the blacking factory, which is a trauma of his youth, and then I suppose the Nicholas Nickleby is a fairly early novel too, and then the later novels were, of course, Great Expectations, and then moving on to Mutual Friend, and eventually to the incomplete Mystery of Edwin Drood, which he only got sort of 2/3 of the way through before he keeled over and died, and it's left to lots of people to write their own conclusions to it. Did Mr. Jasper do the murder? So we don't know.
Cool. Excellent for some added color commentary there.
We've got one chat, I see. Is that one chat coming up? Is there a chat?
So there was, I posted to start us off here. So to just let people know that we were using these tools inside the session. As I believe I mentioned up front, but don't know that everybody who's online here heard, we have been recording this session, and we will post this on the homepage of the CRA website tomorrow afternoon. So you can check for that if you wanted to share this great entertainment with other family and friends, and some more historical insights from before the turn of the prior century. All right, so very good. So Fred, this wraps up the questions, and let's pass it over to you.
Well, thanks, everyone. This was a great change of pace for most of our early evening entertainment of these days, and quite historical and very enjoyable. Now, our next program will be held on Wednesday, December 9th at 5 p.m., Carmel's Climate Change Initiative Update, with our village council persons, Jeff Barron and Carrie Tice, providing the scope, efforts, and timeline for this project's team's work. Zoom details will be posted on the homepage of CRA's website. Now, there will also be a special hearing council meeting on beach fires this Monday, November 23rd, and the standard city council meeting on Tuesday, December 8th. With so much going on, your CRA board also wishes you all a very happy Thanksgiving next Thursday. Thank you and good night.
And thank you, Howard.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
That's it. Thank you.